So far, in our studies of the timeline of English language and literature, we have met the Romans, the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, we've looked at Beowulf, we've moved into the Middle Ages, seen the printing press, and we've learnt about William Caxton. We've met Geoffrey Chaucer and some of the characters from his Canterbury Tales. And then last lesson, you have learned all about iambic pentameter and the rhythm of Chaucer's writing. And you're producing some brilliant work on the back of that. So we thought we would move forward a little bit further now on the timeline to look at Shakespeare. Now, I know you're studying Shakespeare at the moment in drama, so this is perfect timing. And our focus is going to be on the language that Shakespeare uses. And what you will see is that the things we've been learning about Chaucer and what he did with using the vernacular, with using iambic pentameter, with focusing on everyday people, you'll see that Shakespeare is very much cut from the same cloth, to use a metaphor. He also focused on what it meant to be a human. He focused on emotions that affect all of us, whatever our position in society. So rather than just looking at kings and queens, he also wrote about people at all levels of society. In this lesson, we're going to have a look at a very famous speech from a play called As You Like It, and the speech begins, "All the world's a stage." So before we begin, I'd like you to do a 2-minute write, by which I mean I'm going to ask you the question and I want you to just write for 2 minutes with your first instincts, so whatever you think initially. So don't think too deeply about it, just jot down your thoughts. So the question is, where do you think you will be in 10 years' time? So where will you be in 10 years' time, as in, where will you be geographically? Where will you be in terms of your education? Where might you be in terms of your path in life? What about 20 years' time? What will you be doing in 20 years' time? How will your life be different, maybe? What about 30 years? And then finally, what about 50 years? So think about, where do you think you'll be? What do you think you'll be doing? What would you expect for those periods of time? So don't think too deeply about it, just go with what you think. So 2 minutes, and we'll have a bit of Doris Day in the background.
When I was just a little girl, I asked my mother, what will I be? Will I be pretty? Will I be rich? Here's what she said to me. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be. When I grew up and fell in love, I asked my sweetheart, what lies ahead? Will we have rainbows day after day? Here's what my sweetheart said. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be. Que sera, sera.
So the reason I asked you to do that is because if you think about it, there are certain expectations of life, of human life, that we expect to happen or to achieve. So if you think about, well, what will I be doing in 20 years' time? There are certain expectations that you would expect to have achieved or you would expect to be aiming for at that point. And it's kind of always been the way. The picture at the top of this slide, this was drawn in the 1400s, and at this stage people believed throughout society that there were 10 stages. There were 10 stages to life, and every human would go through these 10 stages. Now, predominantly, this has always been focused on the ages of man, primarily because typically throughout history, up until a certain point, men would get the opportunity to go through more stages than women, because women had different roles to play and different limitations on their roles as they do today. And what happened over time, as we got to the Middle Ages, it began to be seen increasingly as 7 ages of man. So there are 7 stages. And if you have a look at that picture underneath, you can see an illustration of the 7 stages, the 7 ages of man. The sculpture on the right is a sculpture in London that was done in the 1990s, and it depicts the same principle, the 7 ages of man. We're going to have a look at a monologue that was written by Shakespeare and put into one of his plays, and this monologue was all about the 7 ages of man. Before we look at the monologue, we need to look at this word monologue, which you've probably heard of before, and we can work out what it means by looking at the different parts of the word. So the prefix mono, if you think about a monorail or a monobrow or monochrome, if you have a monochrome car, it's one colour. If you have a monorail, it has one rail. If you have a monobrow, people might tell you need to pluck them. I would ignore them, but that's what mono means. It means one or single. So a monologue, log, comes from the word logos, which means to speak. So a monologue is one person speaking. There are in Shakespeare's plays there are a lot of monologues. There are constantly moments where one character will begin speaking at length on their own. So it's not a conversation, it's a one person thing. Shakespeare also writes what we call soliloquies. Now, soliloquies are very similar in that they are one person speaking, but the difference is in the prefix, because in the soliloquy it starts with S-O-L, which is the same place that we get solo. And the difference is, if somebody in a Shakespeare play delivers a soliloquy, if they start speaking and they are delivering a soliloquy, they're speaking on their own, but they are specifically alone physically. So they're not speaking to anyone, they're speaking aloud to themselves. So that's solo speaking. A monologue, they're not on their own. Usually a monologue is in front of other people. It's just that they're the only person speaking. So a monologue is one person speaking to lots of people, or one person. It's one person speaking. A soliloquy is also one person speaking, but there's nobody else to hear. They are solo. Our monologue is from a play called As You Like It, and it's spoken by a character called Jacques. Jacques begins with the following lines. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man, in his time, plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. So in this section, Shakespeare has used a metaphor, and the metaphor is that all the world is a stage, by which he means a stage with actors, a stage with scenes, a stage on which people would perform different parts. It's an interesting metaphor, and it's one that we would like you to write about in the worksheet that is in your classroom. So when you've finished this lesson video, have a look at the document, and we are interested to hear what you think about that metaphor. All the world's a stage. It's an extended metaphor, by which we mean that instead of just focusing on the idea of the stage, Shakespeare has included other references to associations with stages and acting, because he's got the stage, he's got players, so actors, he's got exits and entrances, so if you think stage right, stage left, exit stage left, He's got the idea of the parts that people play, and he's also got acts. So acts and scenes are the way that particularly Shakespeare plays are broken up, almost like chapters. So in a book you have chapters, in a play you have acts, and within the acts you have scenes. So when you're watching a play, Act 1 might be set in a castle, and then when Act 1 finishes it might move over to a battlefield. So Act 2 would take place on the battlefield, and the acts break up the time across the story. So after he's delivered his opening lines with the metaphor, Jacques goes on to tell us about each of the 7 stages. Here's what he has to say about stages 1 and 2. At first, the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face creeping like a snail unwillingly to school. So, you've got the infant and you've got the schoolboy. Your question to answer on your worksheet is, what do you think Shakespeare thinks of those in the youngest stages of life? What do you think he feels about babies? What do you think he thinks about schoolboys? And which words give you this impression? So looking at what he said about the infant, how do you think he feels about that infant and why? And then the schoolboy, what does he seem to assume about schoolboys or believe about schoolboys? And how do you know that? So these questions can be answered on the sheet. Stage 3 is the lover. And then the lover, sighing like a furnace, with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow. Now this one, I love this one. This is the teenager. So at this point, the 3rd stage in the life of man is to be a love-struck teenager. And Shakespeare describes him as sighing like a furnace. And he's writing a woeful ballad, so a miserable, dramatic ballad, to his mistress's eyebrow. So the idea is he's picking out things to write about his the love of his life, and he's chosen her eyebrow. Like, imagine if somebody wrote you a love poem and it was about your left ear or something. I mean, I guess it's nice, but it's very over the top. So your question is, what impression do you get of the personality of man at this stage? And which technique is it that gives you this impression? So I want you to look at that line, sighing like a furnace. So that's a particular literary technique. So you need to identify that and then explain what that suggests about what people are like at this stage, according to Shakespeare. Now, stage 4 is the soldier. So Jacques continues, in the words of Shakespeare, then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. So this one's an interesting one. According to Shakespeare, man goes through first 3 stages and then becomes the soldier. Now this could be literal or it could be metaphorical. But what I want you to think about is that phrase, bubble reputation. What on earth could a bubble reputation be? So if you think about reputation is your image. Your reputation kind of goes before you. People have an idea of you from what they've heard about you or from your actions. So that's what your reputation is. But what would a bubble reputation be? So to answer the question, have a think about the qualities that you might associate with bubbles. When you think about bubbles, what do you think of? What kind of ideas come to your mind? What are the properties of bubbles? What do they do? What do they look like? What happens to them? And why might that be a word that Shakespeare chose to describe the reputation of a soldier? Again, answers on the worksheet. Stage 5 is the justice, otherwise known as a judge. And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good cap on lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances. And so he plays his part. Now this one, in order to answer the question for this one, you need to look up some of this vocabulary. So on the worksheet there are a couple of words that you can look up, and it will give you a clue as to what Shakespeare seems to think about people at this stage. So the question, once you've looked at the words, is what do you think Shakespeare thought about people at this stage? And then a secondary question is, could the idea of a judge be a metaphor in some way for other roles that we play at this age? So when you get to kind of 40s and 50s, if you're not a judge, because we're not all judges, are we, literally, but metaphorically, what might that be suggesting about how we age and about what we become as we get older, do you think? Could this be a metaphor for adults in general? Then we get to stage 6. See if you recognise this. The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered Pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice turning again towards childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. So this one is probably a stage that we would all recognise from our own families. And the question for this one is, what do you think Shakespeare thinks of those in this stage of their life? So how do you think he feels about people at this stage? And which words give you this impression? So what does he do in terms of his description that gives you an idea as to how he feels about people at this stage? And so to the final stage, stage 7. Last scene of all, that ends this strange eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Now, that word sans is French and it means without. Your question for this stage on the worksheet is, how do you think Shakespeare feels about this stage of life? And you need to think about those words childishness and oblivion. How does Shakespeare seem to feel about this final stage of life? So your challenge now, and this is also on your classroom, is to redesign the 7 ages of man for your generation. So obviously there are stages in Shakespeare's 7 ages that we recognise. So we all go through the stage of being a baby, and we all go through the stage of going to school. But the middle ones are slightly different now. And what I would like you to do is think about, if somebody was to look at your version of the 7 ages for your generation, what would they see that would tell them, I know that this was written in 2021? What kind of rites of passage do we have now? What kind of things do we expect to happen at certain stages in our lives? What do we expect to experience? What are we all pretty much going to go through at different stages in our lives that Shakespeare doesn't mention because either they weren't relevant or even invented at that point, or because Shakespeare doesn't consider women. So it may well be you could either just redesign the 7 ages of man in general for your generation, or you might just focus on women and write the 7 ages of women for your generation. You could even write the 7 ages of women looking at women going right back to the Middle Ages. Maybe you could look at the role of women then, and then you could bring them right up to the 21st century. The choice is yours. There are some options on Classroom, but we're really asking you to think about creating both a visual and literary representation of the stages that we expect to go through now in the current generation. Okay, so enjoy. We look forward to reading your work. There are a lot more instructions on Google Classroom. Thank you for watching.